Tonight on Big Life, Hellraisers, Hellfire and Sour Gas. Direct action in Alberta.
Daniel, they're killing my kids. And I think it's gross that they say, well, but you can't strike back.
Hello and welcome to the show. Now, Big Life has always been interested in stories of Davids and Goliaths. Okay, I'll confess, the Davids in particular. The bike activists, the APEC alerters, the McProtesters, the marijuana freedom fighters, the tunnelers and the tree dwellers, and so on. We're interested in what makes these people feel compelled to choose direct action and civil disobedience over politer and more patient means of effecting change. For this episode, we've come to Alberta, where a conflict is bubbling up with increasing violence over gas. The people in this story live far from these concrete canyons and really would prefer to be left alone there. These are people who believe modern technology is a bane, invasive, destructive, and harmful to the health of their families. A few hours west of Edmonton is a tiny place called Hythe. Gas and oil wells are here, and 20 minutes on, the farm and family compound of one Wiebo Ludwig.
I think the whole concept of sin has been too moralized and legalized. Sin also goes into the genes.
A former evangelical preacher and Calvinist Christian, Wiebo Ludwig is the patriarch of Trickle Creek Farm. He's lived here with his family for almost 15 years. Wiebo and Mamie Ludwig and their 11 children established their commune with Richard and Lois Boonstras.
I don't think of myself as an individual. I don't look at myself. I don't treat myself as an individual. I'm one with my husband to begin with.
Ludwig's 3 oldest sons married the Boonstras' daughters. Between them, they have 15 grandchildren. They live traditionally and strictly by the scriptures. The Ludwigs knew there were gas fields nearby when they built their farm. They just didn't figure that they were on top of 5 of them. If oil and gas companies meet provincial standards, they're awarded mineral rights to drill under your property, and they've received them 95% of the time. The Alberta Energy and Utilities Board, which okays the development of oil wells on private property, has allowed 10 wells to be built within 2 kilometers of their land.
We deal with Reverend Ludwig basically like every other person in the area. He's had legitimate concerns that he has expressed to the board, and we've investigated them.
They have no right to vent that stuff over us and make us worry and wonder. You know, I mean, it's very obvious that that stuff is deadly.
You know, nobody has a problem with Mr. Ludwig or anybody else having a problem with the oil companies. But the problem here is that they're condoning violence.
This property is smack in the center of an area which, for 2 years, has been plagued by oil patch sabotage. More than 160 acts of environmental terrorism have been committed. Bombings, death threats, shootings. A bullet from a high-powered rifle whizzed through an oil executive's office recently, and suspicion has been directed at Ludwig and his family.
The few things that have happened here, some vandalism in 4 well sites, haven't hurt anybody, but I think the killing fields belong to the industry.
This summer, Ludwig, his wife Mamie, his son Wiebo Jr., and Mr. Boonstra were charged with mischief endangering life in connection with the bombing of a well site. The charges were dropped for lack of evidence. Ludwig claims that his family is now under surveillance.
Well, since they came here in about 1985, they have not had anything to do with the community. They have never socialized with the community as a whole. They're not involved in, you know, their children don't go to school, so you don't see them, you know, in that area at all.
Well, I was taken out of school in 8th grade. It doesn't allow you to relax and enjoy life around you. I mean, like these simple things.
Come on.
Well, when we first came here, we started to get back to the scriptures more word for word, I mean. And the Lord asks the women to wear a head covering. And we don't know all the reasons for that, but one of the reasons was a sign of headship to man. That you're under man as a woman.
And you feel you are?
Yeah. I think the man has to take care of us. We're the weaker sex.
A weaker vessel means a more delicate vessel. You know, it doesn't mean that she's not strong enough to deal with life. She has her own unique talents, her own gifts, but she's the more delicate version of the human race and needs the care, the extra care.
Yeah, like we
Exhibit A.
don't ask our men to nurse the children.
We don't have them arm wrestle with the men either, because we know the results.
People look at it as a dread, but it's really a wonderful thing.
So this is your pharmacy?
Yes, this is our pharmacy. Well, this here is squaw vine. Now that probably grows in our forest. I haven't found it yet, but they say it grows up here, but I just bought this one. But this is used for uterine contractions to ease the pain in childbirth.
Living with the kids and the grandchildren, I just sense that I have much more feelings now for what's going to happen to them in the future. And that's why, too, when I see these industries, what they're doing to their future, I get very tight and irate about it and angry because I see how it's affecting our little kids.
When did you first become aware or become suspicious of malevolent effects of sour gas?
It was 1991, which is about 7 years ago now, when we lost quite a few lambs. It was the first leak. But we were mystified by it. We thought, what in the world's going on?
And then one morning I came there and opened their feeders, and there was a mother there, and she was licking 2 lambs, and I was, at first happy. Then I realized that the lambs were just laying there limp, and they weren't alive.
60% of the lambs were miscarried. So we called the vet, said, look what's going on now. Never heard of this, no disease that can get that kind of a massive miscarriage.
A couple sleeping in the corner.
Goats are a hardier beast than sheep. And when you start losing goats, I mean, there's definitely something weird going on.
It's not happening.
We would think that if it were being caused by something like oil and gas, which is all over this area, then other people should be having the same problems. We ourselves should be having the same problems. People who graze their cattle on the very land where one of these sour gas wells is located should be having problems. But they're not.
Well, it's mysterious. Any guesses?
How much feed did you see piled up in his yard? For one thing, he's an organic farmer. Are his livestock getting enough the proper nutrition?
Why do you have to feed them? And not just let them undo it?
Because we use the milk, and they drink too much of it. The mothers give like 6 gallons, and they don't need that.
Mr. Ludwig, by his own admission, hasn't had these animals checked by a vet.
The vet that we dealt with is aware that the oil and gas industry is causing a lot of trouble here. But this is heavily dominated by the industry, so they just as soon not stick their neck out too far.
They're in denial, basically. When people stand up and say something, they get nervous. They don't like that.
Yeah.
The other thing, too, is farming here has been tough. And they get so much for a well site, so much for a pipe right away. And it helps.
He'll claim we're getting money from the oil companies to...
Yeah.
And our answer to him is, for the little bit of money that the people right here get from the oil company, why would you risk your health of your family and yourself? Why would you do it?
Why haven't studies been done then on his soil, etc.?
Well, he's denied these studies up to now. I would say that that's really the only reason.
They came here once, they said, look, can we put a monitor, government monitor in your place to check to see what's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, how long are you going to do that? Well, the most we can manage is a week. Well, we have intermittent fumigations, you know, that go on all year, and the government monitor here for a week wasn't necessarily going to pick up anything. I said, well, if you're only going to put it here for a week, forget it.
There could be many, many causes for why they don't feel very well. And I think one of the things that the board must do, it must act responsibly. But we are not afraid of acting very decisively if we can attribute the causes to the energy business.
Five years ago, a natural gas line broke, spilling fuel into the local river and hydrogen sulfide, or what's called sour gas, into the air. Wayne Johnston's cattle herd was nearby.
I know definitely what it did to the cows, and I can tell anytime that I'm hit with it anymore that I get emotional, I get thinking about my poor old cows. It's bound to affect a person.
This week, a report into that spill, its cleanup, and its long-term impact on the cattle reveals some alarming details. Scientists concluded the burning off of the gas caused deaths in many cows and caused abortions in others.
Very sad thing to see your girls starting to miscarry, and you know that it's because of those chemicals coming off the flares.
I got pregnant last December. And then we found out later, like about halfway through my pregnancy, that the well north of us here had vented when I was 5 to 6 weeks pregnant.
Your family has suffered some stillbirths. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, we had 4 of them since 1992. Interestingly enough, the first 6 years that we lived here, there was no activity. And we showed none of the symptoms that we now have made a 300 to 400 page anecdotal record on. We still have some pages to print up.
No flaring activity, you mean?
No
gas.
flaring activity, no development. And then in the last 7 years, but particularly the last 4, we've had 9 wells put in here, right around our place. And all the symptoms showed. And then the miscarriages came.
It was about a week before my due date, week and a half. I delivered a boy, and he was dead. It looked like he'd been dead for a couple weeks already in my womb.
When it died, we don't know whether it was the pressure of going through the
Dropping.
yeah, dropping, you know, whether that crushed his skull too much. We don't know just when it died, but
His skull wasn't exactly crushed, it was
mushy.
the bone
Wasn't formed.
It wasn't formed.
Wasn't developed, no.
There was no protective.
Well, has there been an autopsy?
No, it was a home birth, and we kept the placenta for the possibility of testing.
Well, this is weird, you see. I mean, this is sort of gothic, you know. And I don't mean to be morbid in pursuing this, but would we not clear up a lot of mysteries if that placenta, or if any of those babies' remains, were in fact given over to an examiner?
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, what examiner? The government? Will the government tell me the truth so it can kick itself and its hind end with it?
If we were to act, we really would need to investigate what the impact is on his soil, what the impact is on his water, what the impact is on his family.
I also had a miscarriage
When?
due to oil and gas industry. I think it was 5 years ago now. Yeah.
How old are you?
How old am I now?
When you miscarried?
See, I think I was 43 or 44. I don't remember exactly.
In the case of your wife's miscarriage, I feel I have to ask you. She'd already had 11 children.
Yeah.
She was in her 40s.
Yeah.
Is it not almost natural that at that point a woman might risk a miscarriage and that it would not necessarily have anything to do with sour gas?
Well, let me put it this way. I have never said, with all the miscarriages, even in the animals, though it is too telling, you know, there could be a one or two that slips as a result of some other reason. But the fumigations have correlated too much to pretend that none of that's due to
That it's all coincidence.
gas and oil. They've done massive spills here. And I'm saying, look, you have no right to do that. Even if I can't prove that it's actually doing this and this and that, you have no right to endanger and threaten us like that and make my daughters worry about whether this baby will be carried full term or not, anxiously living in this cloud of danger. You know, you have other ways to deal with this. You cannot vent this crap in the air.
You have not one, not two, not three, but 4 children buried here on your own land, yes? And I don't know where that fits within Canadian law, if one is actually permitted to do that without submitting, you know, evidence to an autopsy.
Well,
how does that work?
I'll tell you, Canadian law there too is very shoddy. They do not consider. I told one policeman here who was inspecting a blowout at a well site, and I mentioned to him that Ben had just buried a child, my son. In the course of conversation somewhere, he said, "Oh, buried where?" I said, "On the property." "Well, how old was the child?" I said, "Well, it was stillborn." "Oh," he said, "well, that's okay. You know, that's all right. That's not a person. You should know that."
You know, when Mr. Ludwig claims that he's lost several children, stillborn children, and has buried them on his property, why doesn't anybody dig them up and investigate?
It's a very sad situation, and you know, Daniel, I don't know whether I can really comment on that. I think they are private matters for the Ludwigs. Whether it's a matter for the authorities, I don't know.
And no, has an authority ever asked you to exhume these bodies?
Authority has never even been here, no.
Would you be against it?
I think so, unless there was some real good reason for it. We don't believe that it is the business of authorities where we bury our dead. Especially since they've been responsible for the fumigation of these children.
What worries a lot of people are these sour gas wells. They smell like rotten eggs. The gas is highly poisonous. and research shows the stuff that comes out the top is often a toxic chemical soup. Now the issue has turned violent.
I think it's an illusion to think that as a Christian, you know, when somebody breaks into your house, wants to do violence, that you bend down and pray to God. I think that's a Christian misconception.
But people here do not support Mr. Ludwig.
We wrote a letter and went around to our neighbors, and 42 neighbors within a 3-mile radius of the Ludwig home signed the letter saying that they have never experienced any of these same kinds of problems.
Who do you think has been sabotaging, blowing up plants, shooting at people?
I am somewhat aware of who's been doing it, without naming names. And it's, again, a reaction to the abuse of government, industry, and the courts on the part of people who have basically said, look, it seems the only way to go. It's all we got left. How far they'll go, I suspect the battle is only beginning. When the justice system also falls in that same parameter, and everything you try is hopeless, well, then the moral obligation falls upon us to restrain the madness. And hopefully we will only use as much force as is necessary, which may even mean that people will have to die. Hopefully much less than what the industry would kill, if we can manage it.
Members of the Olds Detachment were called to the scene of a shooting in the area northwest of the town of Olds. There, the RCMP members discovered the body of a male individual who had been shot and found dead at the scene.
The gentleman who shot a vice president there in Sundry likely used justified force. If you think of the harassment they indulged in for 3 years of that man on his own property, I am not surprised that he shot the vice chairman.
There's an echo, at least in my mind, with extremists, I would call them, who will murder a doctor they believe is providing abortion.
Well, I'll let the cat out of the bag for you, Daniel. I think if there's a war on, there are going to be some casualties, very likely. When the government throws $7.5 million at increasing the security rather than solving the problems people are complaining about, they're only upping the ante on the other side. The other side's going to say, well, we better up the ante too. So up and up we go.
What would make you happy?
I've said that before. Simply to talk to the people that are complaining, stop the flaring for a start.
There is a fair amount of flaring going on. But on the other hand, the oil companies are trying to eliminate this and reduce it.
The industry has essentially voluntarily agreed that they would reduce flaring by 25% in the next 2 years and up to 60% in the next 7 years. And of course, the best way to get rid of flaring is to not flare.
No, Daniel, they're killing my kids. And I think it's gross that they say, well, but you can't strike back. You can't even do it in the way of defense. Well, even the criminal code allows me that. You know, that I may defend as responsibly as possible the lives of my children and the future of my family.
Okay. Now you may be asking yourself, how come the Ludwigs haven't just moved out? Well, the Alberta Energy Company did offer the family $800,000 for their property, but there were conditions attached that they objected to, including a permanent move out of the area and, the Ludwigs say, being asked to instruct their children that there had never been any environmental problems. So the Ludwigs refused. Anyway, since we came back from Alberta, highlights of a study have been released. Heart defects at birth are twice as common in that part of Alberta than anywhere else in the province. Also, another bomb went off near Hythe. A meter-wide crater was opened up near a gas well on a service road. Nobody was hurt. And lastly, in England, Barry Horn has survived more than 60 days of his hunger strike. The Animal Liberation Front member is trying to hold the British government to a promise of a commission looking into animal testing.
He's days from death, really. We can't put a time scale on it. The doctors can't even put a time scale on it, but he's very poorly. His eyesight has failed. His liver has been described as erratic, and the doctors are worried about his heart.
Members of New Scotland Yard fear that if Horn dies, he may become the first martyr of the extreme animal rights movement, unleashing a new wave of eco-terrorism across Europe. We'll be bringing you that story. For Big Life, I'm Daniel Richler. Good night.